Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Photographic Society's Historical Group and this latest in the series of collections and archive visits. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce our host, Dr. David Barber, who's a committee member of the Historical Group and a photo historian in his own right. David, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, James Hamilton. James is Research Principal of the Signet Library in Edinburgh. His talk is titled Returning to Robert Adamson, The Origins of a Series of Calotype Views of St Andrews, 1846. Afterwards, we'll be having a Q&A session. So during his talk, the comments box will be open if you have a question you wish to ask James. So James, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure on behalf of the Society of Writers to His Majesty's Signet to welcome you all to the Signet Library this evening. I thought I'd introduce ourselves photographically. We are an ancient Scottish body of solicitors, and when this photograph was taken by the great Aberdonian George Washington Wilson in about 1869, our society's legal activities had extended already over 500 years. And our library at this point was about 150 years old. The building you're looking at here, however, wasn't quite so old. This is only, it's 40 years old at this stage. It's just been redecorated for the first time. Now, Washington Wilson, of course, was a professional commercial photographer, and we own this image in a number of forms as a result. This album and print, of course, and then a stereo view taken some months earlier when the refurbishment was underway, and this lantern slide, which is one of the most agonizing things to photograph. Now, these form part of what I call a small but useful collection of Scottish historical photography. I mean useful in the sense that we can use it to present to visitors more or less all of the important names in Scottish photography during the 19th century, and most of the important techniques. And we can also illustrate the ways that photography was enjoyed, used, exchanged, the part it played in networks, etc., etc., etc. But there's always one important gap in that collection until October 2022, when on Halloween I was recataloguing some rather anonymous-looking 19th century volumes, when I found myself confronted with this front board and gazed at it for a few seconds almost in shock and thought, well, my goodness, at last we have our calotypes, because this is what we were missing. Calotypes are quite special to Scottish legal history as well as to Scottish photographic history, because the earliest photographic club in the world, or the one that's recognized as the earliest, is the Edinburgh Calotype Club. And this was dominated by lawyers. And a library like ours, founded by lawyers, is interested in anything cultural that lawyers get up to. I was hoping that this was going to turn out to be examples of Calotype Club work, and I was perfectly prepared for it to be a volume full of salt prints that had faded out to white. The difficulty in creating an enduring salt print is part of the history of the medium, after all, and be a good way of showing it. But when I turned to the title page, instead I was greeted with this, far grander than I was anticipating, with the golden printing, but also at the bottom of the page, the dreadful words Hill and Adamson. And of course, I knew what that meant, that we'd gone from having something interesting and quite valuable in our hands to essentially holding Gutenberg, with all of the anxiety and the responsibility that was going to come from that. Now, we're going to be discussing this album, which this is my first introduction to it. We're going to start by having a look through the album and discussing what comes from that. Then we're going to look at where its origins were in St Andrews, in the photographers working there before Robert Adamson came to Edinburgh in 1843. Then we're going to look at the provenance of this particular copy of the album first, and then consider what we know about provenance of other surviving copies of it. And if there's time at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit more speculatively about Robert Adamson himself. So First of all, what can we say about what we can hope to learn from an album like this? Having an album implies selection, implies gathering, implies choice by a compiler, whether that be the artist or not. And hopefully looking at an album give us a sense of how that compiler or how the artist related the images to one another and thought about them and felt about them. Having a copy of an album that exists in a number of survivors enables us again to look at the image sequence within it. Is it the same? Is this how these albums were compiled? Or was there a different technique? Are we going to have to cope with multiple sequences with different meanings attached to them? And finally, we're going to be looking at what happened to the albums once they're completed. How are they received by the public? Who were the public? And hopefully there'll be some interesting conclusions we can draw from all of that. Now, just to say something about the albums that did come from Carlton Hill between 1843, when Robert Adamson took the house on Carlton Hill, until his very early and tragic death in 1848. There's basically three kinds as I see it. This is a crude division between the three, and you can be more subtle about it, but this is the basic three areas. First of all, there are the large compilation albums put together by David Octavius Hill. Quite a few of these would have been put together after the death of Adamson. Things like the Stanfield album, the Bicknell album, which I've had the privilege of seeing, albums gifted to institutions like the Royal Scottish Academy and the Royal Academy. So there's that kind. Then there are collectors' albums put together by individuals separate from the partnership. The Signet Library owns one of these, which was compiled by a psychologist in the 19th century called Sir Arthur Mitchell. And I've seen another one recently in the National Library of Scotland put together by the Brodie family of artists. St Andrews University Library have digitised quite a few other examples of these. And finally, there's the sort of album that we're looking at tonight, the St Andrews album, a series of Calotype views of St Andrews, the only album produced, as far as we know, at Carlton Hill in numbers. So there are multiple copies out there. So we're going to start by looking at the album itself. And we're joined tonight by our conservator, Joe Hockey, who's going to be turning the pages for me. If I just find a way to share this part of the screen with you. Just switch across to the camera. That's it, good. So what I'm going to do is simply talk through the images one by one, very, very briefly. We're not going to linger on them. We'll come back to the title page as we go. The first image here is the West Port of St Andrews, the ancient entrance to the city. Now, I would say that starting with an image like this might imply that we're going to go on a tour of St Andrews through the album. There's that kind of sequence, but I'm afraid that there really isn't. Let's turn the next page, Joe, please. Now, it's a very luxuriously produced album, and each page is interleaved. We've added extra interleaving for preservation purposes, but we've removed those for this evening. So this is the College Church of St Salvatore, taken slightly from height, which is interesting. So can we move on to plate number 3, where we're going to be staying with the College Church. And this is one of a sequence of 2 images of this. Let me just get that the right way around for you. That's it. This is one of 2 images in sequence of the College Church, and they show the same scene but at different stages. This shows, I believe, a wall and gate after they've been cleared. And if we go to the next one, there we are. You can see that I think this is the earlier of the 2 images. I'm willing to be corrected on this, but you can see there's a gate and a wall there that were not before. And moving on. It's quite a delicate business, so bear with us, please. The next image is of both an older and a younger building. This is the United College building of St Andrews, you'll have noticed how depopulated these seem. And this is a feature of almost all of the images in the album. And it's somewhat reminiscent, I think, of some of the Greyfriars images taken in Edinburgh, that usually busy and crowded places are photographed without their crowds and without their human presence. And now, one of my favorite images of the album coming up next. This is the view down South Street, looking towards the east end of the cathedral and with the roundel visible. This is just a beautiful picture. I think there's very little commentary to make beyond that. And we're moving now to two really lovely images. The first of which, this is again a pair of images. Well, let me just reorientate this. There we are. This is what's called the Pens. It's the ceremonial entrance to St Andrews Cathedral, and it was a favourite subject for the St Andrews photographers as a group. I should perhaps introduce Hill and Adamson to those of you who are wondering who we're talking about at this point, and this might be a good point, a good moment to do so. There is a basic narrative around the Hill and Adamson partnership, which begins with the invention of the Calotype process by Fox Talbot at the end of the 1830s. One of the top European scientists of optics and light, Professor David Brewster, took the technique, which was the first to allow a negative to produce multiple print copies from itself. Brewster took it to St Andrews, where there's some kind of a brains trust with an existing interest in optics and photography, who took it on. And there's a number of names involved in this activity, such as William Furlong, Dr. John Adamson, and his younger brother, Robert Adamson. They experimented with the technique and tried to improve it and played with it generally. And in 1843, Robert Adamson decided to make it his profession and moved down to Edinburgh and took on the house at Carlton Hill to do so. This album, published in 1846, obviously postdates that moment and shows later work that they're engaged in. Let's go to the next page now. One of the curiosities of the historiography of the partnership is that shortly after Adamson's arrival, he was introduced to a landscape artist, David Octavius Hill, the Hill of the Hill and Adamson partnership, who at that time was engaged in an enormous project to paint 400 plus churchmen as a commemoration portrait of the 1843 disruption of the church. The early historiography, the first published writing on this, started to appear at the turn of the 20th century. Some of it that was published a little bit later on can be dated earlier to the early 1880s. And there's the first major book by Schwartz, published about the end of the 1920s. The earlier you go, the more the creative skill and energy of the partnership is allotted to Hill, and the more Adamson is given an artisanal role, a workshop role. This has changed over the years, with Adamson coming more and more into the picture as a creator. Unfortunately, there's not enough documentary material remaining about Robert Adamson. There are no letters, very little in the way of diaries. Very few people recorded their impressions of him. There's no chance to write a proper biography about him. So really all you're left with is the ability to write a history of how people wrote about him and to try and understand why they took that approach to him. Anyway, here we are at the Pens again. This is one of the more brilliant pictures in the album. You'll notice that it's taken into facing into quite strong light. You have the horse and cart position just so there in front of the shadow, and you have the interchange of the shapes. It's a beautiful piece of work. Moving on again. And here we arrive at the cathedral itself and can see the east gable on the left and ancient St. Rule's Tower on the right, and the graveyard in front. We're going to stay there for a little while now. If we move on again, we're zooming in to the east gable. And if I wonder if I can point out to you here I'm not able to, unfortunately. You may be able to see the figure of a top-hatted man sitting there in front. I believe, I'm willing to be corrected, I believe this is quite close to where Robert Adamson's grave now is. Okay, moving on again, we're going to stay with the cathedral, but just outside it. And here we see the city wall with the east gable just visible over the top. The city wall was one of, not a favorite location, but it's a location of some of the more successful images, I think. I like the use of a single figure. What was probably quite a busy thoroughway, but they managed to find a moment of quiet to take it. And moving on again. Let me just rotate again. Some of the features of the digital revolution, things only rotate from right to left. Here we are again at the St Andrew's Cathedral, the west front and the south aisle. You'll gather from this sequence that the images are in clumps by location, not so much by sequence. There is no obvious route on a map between those clumps. It's just how they are. Now we're going to, the next one is going to show us the castle, and it's quite a remarkable picture, I think, because of where it's taken from. This is obviously a very difficult viewpoint to choose. Here's the castle, beautiful, beautiful composition, taking in the cliff and taking all of the textures of the seafront there. And on. Here we have the foretower of the castle. And again, note the textures and the difficulty of the viewpoint that they've chosen here. This is not an effort that began in 1846, as we'll see later on. And we're going to be staying with the castle over the next few pictures. So here we are with the foretower of the castle. Let me just get that the right way round for you. Here. And once again, the wonderful textures, and the deliberately sought textures, I am sure, and the difficulty of the viewpoint that they've chosen. The next one's something of a relief, where they have some solid ground to put the tripod on. But again, a view of the castle. Possibly one of the least interesting pictures in an otherwise interesting album. The next image of the castle takes the interest in texture to an extreme. There's something almost surreal, almost abstract about it. We leave the castle now and very briefly visit the harbour at St Andrews. From memory, I think there's only a couple of images in the Hill and Adamson oeuvre of the harbour, and they're both beautiful. You could pick either one. This is the more depopulated of the two, as might be appropriate for the album. And then, again, one of my absolute favourites, we're going to be looking at the city wall, and with the lamp as a little nod towards some kind of modernity. But it's not just a picture of an antiquarian place, is it? With the houses in the background. And this isn't just a collection of antiquarian images, as the next one shows. Here is the then almost new Madras College building. This is one of the places where Dr. John Adamson taught. And I wonder if he is actually one of the figures visible here in the courtyard. Now, the next image is by a long distance the most remarkable in the album, and maybe one of the most remarkable in the whole Hill and Adamson works. This is the North Street fisherfolk of St Andrews. It has been frequently, and you might not be surprised to hear this, mistaken for the New Haven scene. But there are great differences between the New Haven fishing community and the St Andrews one. The St Andrews one was poverty-stricken. Now, what I'd like to point out here, first of all, is the use of height in the image. We're not at ground level. We're not shooting low, as Adamson was fond of doing. And we have this diagonal line of the curve of the road running from right to left. My own feeling about this image is it's the most usual interpretation is this is a heavily posed picture and these people have been placed. I'm not sure. I think the angle may be what is winning the picture. And I have a suspicion, not something I'd bet my life on, but my suspicion is the woman who makes this image so cinematic, that makes it look like a moving image, the woman carrying the basket and the baby in the foreground, who will have had to hold that position for some considerable time to make the picture. I think she is better dressed than the other women in the picture. I think she is possibly shod, which most of them aren't. And I wonder if she's part of the Adamson party put there to make the picture, but otherwise the community itself being left undisturbed. It's one view. And moving on to an absolute Adamson favorite, the Blackfriars Chapel. This particular version of it with the woman by the lamppost, there aren't that many prints of it. It's interesting to find it here. The Blackfriars Chapel has Madras College behind it, so it's not a purely antiquarian affair. And then in an album of only 25 images, some of the copies having fewer, 24, 21, another extraordinary composition. Again, the surrealists would have had a field day with this one. Very difficult technically, with the horse in the middle having to remain still for a long period. The balance of the positioning of that with the city behind it. Extraordinary picture. And we have one more to go. The doyen of scholarship of the St Andrews album is Professor Graham Smith, and it's to him that we owe the knowledge that the Spindle Rock, which is what we're looking at here, was a favourite location for the Adamson family, a place they visited frequently and they'd photograph themselves at. So that's our walk through the album. I'll just take us back now to the presentation itself. Right, so let's talk about what we can learn from what we've just seen. The first point is that the images are taken over a period of at least 2 years. And that implies, at least, that the creative relationship between Robert Adamson and the circle of photographers in St Andrews continued in parallel with his life in Edinburgh. So here, again, we're seeing the gate and the wall in front of the collegiate church. And here, presumably sometime later on, the wall has been cleared away. I think that's the order it's in. There are other instances, particularly with the collegiate church spire, of work being done between images taken by Adamson then. Also, that the presence of modern buildings and landscape views, here Madras College, and here the view of the beach, imply that this is not a rehearsal of a prearranged curriculum of views of St Andrews. Brewster, amongst with all of his group there, were lovers of the ancient St Andrews. Brewster had this wonderful phrase calling it a veritable Pompeii within Scotland. But I don't think this album is just about that. Now, most discussions of Hill and Adamson albums start with an advert that was placed by Hill in the Edinburgh Evening Courant at the beginning of August 1844. Here's the copy, and let's zoom in on the advert itself. There's a number of things I'd like to draw your attention to. The first is the language that Hill used to describe himself and Adamson. Hill here describes himself as the Secretary of the Royal Scottish Academy, above all, and as the man who will select and arrange the subjects. How does that code to you? It may suggest that a creative selection, a creative involvement, it may feel just editorial. Another phrase that Hill used from time to time about his involvement in the partnership was that of providing artistic direction. And again, you may differ with me on what that exactly means, whether that means that he is indeed involving himself in the makeup of a photograph, in its composition, in its subject matter, or it means something more to do with promotion and advocacy. The role of Robert Adamson here is described as as providing the chemical manipulations. Now, this is something I am reasonably confident did change in meaning over the course of the 19th century. At the time Adamson was in Edinburgh, we're at the end of about a half a century where chemistry had been something of a gentry fad. And we see this in people like Mary Shelley attending lessons, and indeed Fox Talbot's own experiments that led to the invention of the Calotype process. By the time the partnership begins to be written about in seriousness, at the beginning of the 1880s, and then at the turn of the century, and then at the end of the 1920s, that has changed. And the idea of a chemist or an engineer is firmly on that side of the machine world that the art world sometimes felt itself to be in argument with or in conflict with. Look now at the choices that, the offerings rather, that Hill proposes to produce in terms of albums. We have 6 here. The first of these, The Fishermen and Women of the Firth and Forth, looking at the number of prints that were produced from negatives of the New Haven images, it's clear that a real serious attempt was made to produce this album. And at the start of the 1990s, Dr. Sarah Stevenson created a brilliant recreation of what that album might have been, with the same title, by the way. It's Hill and Adamson's Fishermen and Women of the Firth and Forth. And if you've not met Hill and Adamson before and you're thinking about which book would be a good way in, there aren't any bad ones. That's a very, very good one. The other of the 6 all represent photographic responses, either to work that was being undertaken at that time in print, engraving, or lithograph form, or work that had succeeded recently in those forms. So contemporary with Hill and Adamson, the Sobieski Stewarts were producing a volume of prints about Highland costume, which was very published not about the same time as the St Andrews volume, to great controversy. The architectural structures of Edinburgh and Glasgow, covered quite recently in Scotland by Thomas Hosmer Shepherd and many others. The old castles, abbeys, etc. in Scotland, currently, at that time, was coming out as a part work by Robert Billings, who may even been working in St Andrews on his images of the city at the same time as the images in the Calotype album here we're looking at tonight were made. And finally, volume 6, The Portraits of Distinguished Scotchmen. That's buying into an ancient tradition, or at least a Scottish Enlightenment tradition, with volumes produced by the likes of John Pinkerton, of collections of portraits of distinguished people. So these are all, I suppose, seen as either already market tested or things that will be current when published. Unfortunately, none of them did come out, which is something of a shame. Now, finally in here, I want to draw your attention to the phrase "in the middle." The volumes will be produced in a style of elegance on a paper the size and quality of Robert's views in the Holy Land. Joel Roberts, the artist, was a great, great friend for many, many years of David Octavius Hill. And his lithographs of the Holy Land were part work that came out, published, as Hill says here, in great quality. And this was the model that Hill took for his the albums he did release of the Hill and Adamson work. They're characterized by being very large. Here's the set of the Holy Land images. This is imperial folio. It's going to be a job for you to pick up one of these. Beautifully leather bound. This is really what the Hill albums look like, but it isn't what the St Andrews album looks like. And one idea to which I subscribe is that the inspiration or the emulation that the St Andrews album is attempting is this album put out by Fox Talbot by subscription in 1845, Sun Pictures in Scotland. Just take a look at the cover here. It's very simple, quite nicely bound, but simply bound with a plain gold block title in the middle. Like the St Andrews album, 25 images in it. However, because it was published by subscription to 100 recipients, 100 copies of each of those prints had to be made. That is a very tall order. With Calotypes, yes, you can reproduce images, but it doesn't mean it's easy or straightforward. And the response, if I'm right in thinking that St Andrews album was a response, was to take a slightly different approach. Here again is the Signet copy's front cover. Now I'm going to put next to it a picture of the University of Glasgow's copy of the work. And as you can see, it has the same very pleasant binding. Green wash silk, the gold block title, nicely 3/4 bound in leather. The other copies that survive, there's one at the Getty Centre, which we've all experienced some anxiety at the Getty Centre of the last few days, I'm sure. St Andrews has 3 copies, one incomplete. Album 22, which they obtained in 1902, album 23, and the Hay Fleming album, bequeathed in 1931 by the great St Andrews historian and collector David Hay Fleming. There are some differences between accounts of this album and the digitized version that St Andrews have produced. I'm not quite sure what the story is there yet, but the St Andrews digitizations are magnificent and have been such a help in researching this talk. We've looked at the University of Glasgow copy just now. That was part of the Duggan bequest in the early 1950s, and Duggan obtained it from Carlton Hill in the late 1940s, where a lot of Hill and Adamson material still remained. Finally, the copy of the Avery Library in the University of Columbia. Now, the sequence of subjects within the album that we've just gone through, the Signet copy, is that followed by the University of Glasgow's album and largely by the Avery Library's album. The Glasgow album and our own have not been rebound in any way. They're in the original binding. Most of the other copies have either been disbound and boxed or rebound at some point, which leaves a question about their sequence. However, within these disbound copies, there are stretches of sequence which are the same as in the Glasgow album and in our album, which makes me think that there probably is, or at least there's a likelihood of there being an established sequence of subjects as we go through. So how did they cope with it? Well, first of all, of course, there are fewer copies. That we may now have found all of those that were made, as far as we know. The albums hold the same subjects in the same order, that at least is my theory, but not always the same image. So here we have the Signet Library's image of the pens with the horse and cart. This image is used in alternative copies. This is the pens again, but with the 2 male figures at the end and the lamppost. Likewise, here is the Signet Library's copy of the Blackfriars Chapel. Note the woman by the lamppost. Far more commonly, these albums hold this version of that image with a man by the lamppost. Let's look now at the title page. There's something very unusual and strange about this. First of all, it's in gold printing, and I don't mean yellow or orange, it's actually gold printing. This is extremely unusual. And I asked around experts in Scottish printing of the time for ideas about who might have been approached to do this. And the name of the Lysers studio in Edinburgh St James Square came forward a few times. I have been through so many books trying to find examples of gold printing from this era, especially from Lysers. This is as close as I could get. This is from about 20 years before the St Andrews album, and it's much less restrained. You can feel the Victorian era coming in this. This is an example of gold print from Lysers, however. The sheer restraint of the title page reflects also, if you compare it with the title page of Pencil of Nature by Fox Talbot, the 1844 artwork, which is so Victorian and flamboyant, and it's a lovely design, but it's a completely different feel behind it, isn't it? And even if you look at David Octavius Hill's title pages in his gift albums, these are, again, much more Victorian, much more flamboyant. There's this joyous, almost Wild West feel to using every type in the box there. So why is the title page of the St Andrews album quite like this? And it's one thing that remains a mystery. Also, what remains a mystery is why this particular text appears at the bottom. Now, note it says, published by D.O. Hill and R. Adamson at their Calotype studio, Carlton Stairs, Edinburgh, 1846. Now, at this time, very roughly, there were three ways in which an album of this kind could make its way in the world. First of all, publication. This is a word with a legal meaning, which is that you have made your publication available for general sale to the public. So anyone can rock up and buy one from a bookstore, and more or less any bookstore can get copies if they go to the effort. You've registered the title of Stationers' Hall in London, and your title will appear in the various lists of official publications that circulated at the time. And if I'm looking through these lists, I find, for example, that Talbot's Pencil of Nature is indeed present in the Stationers' Hall lists. Secondly, you could opt for a subscription publication, which is distribution to a prearranged list of subscribers. In the case of some pictures in Scotland, there are about 100 of them. A copy of this went to St Andrews, as Brewster ensured they had one. They would have seen it. And finally, there are gifts, volumes given to friends, family and others, and the Bicknell and Stanfield albums, I believe, are examples of this. The problem with all that is, although this points towards us being a publication, the text published by D.O. Hill and R. Adamson at the Calotype studio, etc., is also that which gets stamped on the back of the individual prints, the individual salt prints, sold by Hill's brother, Alexander Hill, at his shop in Princes Street in Edinburgh. Individual photographs had no such publication restrictions at the time. It'd be later in the century that you'd be able to patent a photograph and preserve your copyright in it thereby. That was yet to come. So I regard the text here as somewhat mysterious. We don't quite know what the intention behind it is. I wanted to rejoin this particular image again, simply to enjoy it in actual fact. I think it's by far the most interesting. There's two versions of it. We've got this version in an original salt print type, and we have another copy here, which is a carbon print made by Thomas Annan at the end of the 1870s of the other version of it. Very little has changed. The cinematic figure in the middle resumes her posture. A couple of people have organically shifted their positions or gone, but it's largely very, very similar. But you can look at the shadows and see some time has gone past, whether I'm not sure if it's going to be half an hour or a number of hours, and opinions differ on that. We know from Professor Smith's scholarship that the community here was of great interest and concern to Dr. John Adamson as a medical man. And we know that it was also of great interest before his move to Edinburgh for Robert Adamson, as we can see from this pre-1843 picture of the same community. Now, if I just jog back to the 1846 image for a moment, take another look. Where are the men? And the response, is this a nunnery? Passes through my head briefly. But moving forward here are the men. And here's Robert Adamson shooting low again, very close to the ground for effect. Very much a photographer's trick, I think. And here are the men. And barring the comforting top-hatted figure in the background, this is quite a wonderfully threatening picture. There's a lot of atmosphere to it. Clearly a long exposure, which the participants who are just about their business have failed to maintain stillness in any way. So let's start talking about the continuities between the St Andrews album and this pre-Carlton Hill work. And the way we'll do this is by considering what survives of it. The four main albums of this work that I've referred to in this respect, the first being the Tartan album. This is a small album. There's barely a dozen pictures in it. And the beauty of it was sent by John Adamson to Fox Talbot before Robert Adamson left St Andrews. So we know that every image in it predates St Andrews. We don't predates his move to Edinburgh. We don't know the identity of every photographer in it. It's very much a group project that's going on in St Andrews at that time. Then there are two Adamson family albums. The first of these is they're both at the National Museum of Scotland, and I spent an extremely happy morning last year going through these remarkable things. The first of them, number 2 in this list, is something of a show album for John Adamson, and it tracks the experiments of his group, both chemically and in terms of composition, for quite a long period, right from the beginning, 1841-ish, when they started their Calotype experiments, through to the era of wet collodion prints 20 years later. So it continues to be put together after Adamson's left and also after Adamson's death. And it includes in it some images from the St. Andrews album that we have here. The third one is, I tend to think of it as of a failure CV. This is where you find the faded prints. This is where you find the failed compositions. This is where you find the experiments that went a little bit wrong. And it's all the more charismatic for it. It's a wonderful album. And finally, something of a survivor, the Brewster album, which is crouching in the Getty collection with the Getty's copy of the St. Andrews album at the moment. We are very, very unfortunate in the surviving archival records from this group and from this period generally. A lot of Brewster material was lost in a fire. The Brewster album appears to be a collection not just by Professor Brewster, but by his family, containing all kinds of photographers from the time. It's a rich mix. Now, what I'm going to do now is focus on the Tartan album, because we can date it so closely, and compare some compositional decisions and experiment. So on the left, we have the Signet albums, print of the Collegiate Church, taken from height, but otherwise leaning quite heavily on a composition decided upon before Adamson moved to Edinburgh. The difference being the Tartan album print here, of course, that it's photographed quite low to the ground. Signet album plate 22 shows the woman by the lamppost in the Blackfriars Chapel. The Blackfriars Chapel also appears, but from the other side in the Tartan album. And this is, you can see this is a much more populated image. They adored the Blackfriars Chapel. This is where they really went to play. And there are so many different versions of this that predate 1843. This is a particular favourite of mine, with the top-hatted figure admiring the chapel and the young people in the background there. Another one. There are so many. And then this one, which must be my favourite. The print has faded somewhat, but all I'd say is you should see, if you think this is faded, you should see the Edinburgh Calotype Club work. I love the children in a row along here, set against the height of the fence and in parallel with the horizon. So much humour and warmth in that image. So a favourite place for them, one they experimented with, played with, tried different things with. And here we have one of the more difficult shots, or in my opinion, one of the difficult shots, the Edinburgh Castle, taken with the textures of the shoreline before it. And we see from this that this is something they encountered and mastered very, very early on. And I think they deserve considerable credit for doing so. Again, Collegiate Church, again, different heights been used, but the basic composition remains the same or very, very similar between pre-1843 and circa 1846. Moving away from the St. Andrews albums a little bit here, do you remember I was talking about the left to right diagonal in the Fisherfolk image? Well, here we see it in one of the Hill and Adamson Linlithgow station images from their tour in Linlithgow. Note the comparison with the picture of Burnside, the farmhouse at Burnside, where the Adamson brothers grew up on the right from the Tartan album. Here again, you have that diagonal. Here again, you have the use of height. And look at where the horizon is. It's just about halfway up the image, and it's used to define the position of everything underneath it. I picked one of the early portrait works because one of the criticisms made of the pre-1843 work, and one of the justifications for believing that Hill had a strong creative role in the partnership, is that the early portraits lack something that was present later on. I am not sure about that. Now, the Tartan album image on the right comes from a 1980s publication of these images and perhaps lacks something for that. I'm lucky to find a National Museum digitization of it, which I'm very grateful to be able to use, of the same image. I think this shows that you can go from here whether that's what happened or not, but you can go from here to the portraiture that did take place in Edinburgh. Here you see the dark background. Here you see the thinking about how people relate to one another. Here's the success at maintaining an expression through a long exposure, and all of the things that you see later on, creating the joyous portraits that would follow. And here is the proof of authorship in this instance, the initials RA on the negative. The tartan album image here is one of my favourites of all of the Hill and Adamson work. Here is a group of figures on the horizon, shot into the light, allowing their silhouettes to create the impression. This reminds me so much of work I've seen that was taken later in the 19th century in the American state of Montana, which is a huge flatland, and where you saw photographers like Evelyn Cameron, who were unable, because of that, the nature of the landscape, to look for, converging lines of perspective to make their image up. Instead, deployed the horizon and attempted to relate their subjects, whether it be buildings or people or activity, to that horizon. And this is what you can see the Adamsons doing here. The later Hill and Adamson work has some marvelous examples of this very playing with light and this courage to, even with the difficulties of producing Calotype negatives at all, the willingness to experiment in this way. I love this New Haven fishwives shot into the sun, using the light behind to create these halos behind them and to firm up and dignify their figures. And what we think came very late in the partnership, this wonderful picture of a tree in Colinton. It's known as the fairy tree. Whether this is a picture of a tree or a picture of light, be the judge. But it's a wonderful picture that you would struggle to reproduce with modern equipment. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Now, switching from that now, the continuities between St Andrews before 1843 and with the work that came later. Let's look at the Signet Library album and try and work out where it came from. And here we have a main character to introduce, David Lane, one of the great historians of the 19th century Scotland, perhaps its greatest collector of art and books, and coincidentally, librarian here at the Signet Library between 1837 and 1878. I'm afraid the achievements stop at the door of the library. He was notorious for his poor record keeping here, the untidiness. Books would arrive and their arrival not recorded for years. If they were recorded wrongly. And this is both a frustration and an opportunity in tracing the history of our individual volume. Let's start by looking at the front cover again. And instead of looking at the gold block title, we're now looking at the oval ownership stamp above it. These can be dated. We used these have used these throughout the library's life. The first one was introduced in 1722 and was used up until 1800. That was replaced in 1800 by something called the short lion stamp, which was replaced in embarrassment in 1815. This is the third. The long lions stamp, based on the Hanoverian coat of arms, that lasted between 1815 and 1870. So its presence here gives us an absolute cut-off date by which time the book arrived here, as in 1870. Now let's look at the guard book itself. Now, what the guard book is the internal catalogue of the library. The library issued public catalogues in print every 50 years or so, the last of these being in 1837 at this point. And a copy of that would have been cut up into its individual record slips and pasted into an album for internal use. Later acquisitions would be written down on slips and added. And I will just take my cursor around the entry for the St Andrews album, which is here, and I hope you can see that. The handwriting here is librarian David Lane's. So we know, because he died in 1878, this was done before then, we already know it's before 1870. The far neater handwriting of the number here, the shelf mark, is that, I believe, of sub-librarian Ferguson. Ferguson died in unfortunate circumstances in 1861, and I suggest this is our second cut-off point before which the album could appear. Now here, the album is listed under the heading of St Andrews. It's only listed under the heading of St Andrews. There's no author creator artist attribution elsewhere in the catalogue. Now, this is this contrasts with the treatment of David Octavius Hill's lithographs and his engravings, as we can see in the lower picture here, which are under Hill's name. Here are his youthful lithographs of Perthshire, which also appear under Perthshire elsewhere in the catalogue. Here are his engravings of the Glasgow and Dunkirk Railway, which also appear under Glasgow. So engravings and lithographs entitle you to an artist or author attribution, but being a photographer does not. All Adamson and indeed Hill get here is a publisher's attribution, which is really quite different, I'm sure you'll agree. There's a lovely quotation by David Hay Fleming, one of the former owners of a series of Calotype views of St Andrews, the copy that was donated to the Hay Fleming Library in St Andrews. Thus it is that truth is falsified and good men slandered. This is where Adamson begins to be separated from his creation, I think, in the Signet Library catalogue. I say that tongue in cheek. Now, during the late 1840s and early 1850s, the library underwent a reorganization. And during that reorganization, blue labels, such as this one, were used to put the shelf mark into the book. Now, this particular one, as you can see, has got an earlier number written underneath it, and the label has gone over the top here. And just for once, we have a date of acquisition written in David Lang's hand there. Let's hope it's accurate. Look now at the inside cover, where this is, of the St Andrews album, and you see there's a shape left behind by a blue label that has been there but has fallen off or been removed. Underneath it, I can tell you this is the hand of one of the later librarians. This is going to be very late 19th century or early 20th century. So there's no older shelf mark underneath it, which gives us a range, really, of likely arrival for the book between 1848 and 1855. There's other sources that we could use in this respect. From 1852, there's a books acquired list that's published every year. Lang leaves all sorts of things out of that, and in any case, the album doesn't ever appear in it. And there are lists of donations which appear in the curator's lists, again, incomplete, but again, the album is missing from that. Our treasurer's records show no transactions taking place with any dealer we know to have had a link with Hill or Adamson, including Alexander Hill. So I think we're getting down to 1848 to 1855, 1856 arrival point, but we don't really know beyond that. So what about the other albums? The Glasgow album appears, from Roddy Simpson's research, to have been acquired directly from the Ingalls family of photographers at Carlton Hill. Carlton Hill was occupied continuously by photographers from 1843 until just after the Second World War, when I suppose they're rather like the ravens at Tower Hill. As soon as the ravens leave the Tower of London, London falls. As soon as the photographers leave Carlton Hill, Edinburgh falls. The collector Robert Duggan went there in the late 1940s and acquired a large amount of Hill and Adamson material, which now forms the Duggan collection at the University of Glasgow. This album appears to be part of it. The Avery album at the University of Columbia we know was accessioned in 1896. That's all we know about it. The first of the St Andrews albums, Album 22, was purchased in the summer of 1902, and there's something curious about the record of that because it's very specific in stating that the acquisition was not second-hand, or from an antiquarian dealer, and nor was it a donation. It was specifically bought new. Where from? Was that Carlton Hill, or have we misunderstood and is it somewhere else? The Getty album we know was formerly with the book dealer Krauss in New York in the 1970s. There's no earlier info beyond that. So it's entirely possible, as a theory, that the few copies of St Andrews that were made actually remained at Carlton Hill sometimes for decades after their production. And I wonder if the tragic early death of Robert Adamson had something to do with this. Of these copies, the Signet Library one is the only one with provenance suggesting a contemporary, meaning pre-1856 acquisition, an acquisition within reason at the time of its made. The classification of the Signet Library copy under a subject heading only without an author or creator or artist attribution may point to reluctance on contemporaries of Robert Adamson to place photographers alongside artists, engravers and creators. And of course, That would be no surprise to anybody, and it's part of the drive behind the later 19th century effort to establish photography as an art and photographers as artists. One final thought, and don't hold my feet to the fire on this, but the Signet Library copy may be the first photo book acquired by a major collection, not for its novelty or for its scientific interest, as photographs being brand new at that time, but for its subject matter alone, bought here because it contained pictures of St Andrews, not because they happen to be photographs. So much for the provenance. I just want to finish with some musings about Robert Adamson. This is going to be much, much more speculative, and I'm really just talking aloud now. The existing scholarly literature about Robert Adamson and the partnership with Hill does generally assume or act as if that after Adamson moved to Edinburgh, the former partnerships and former teamwork with the photographers at St Andrews ceased. I think the series of Calotype views of St Andrews albums establishes that that's unlikely, that it did continue. Adamson spent a fair amount of each year in St Andrews, and we have no idea how they communicated in the meantime because no letters suggest. I would like to suggest that Adamson was part of two photographic partnerships or photographic groups, one in Edinburgh, one in St Andrews. It's also possible that the presence of Hill in the partnership as a landscape artist, as somebody with a role in the Royal Scottish Academy, somewhat came to the rescue of Victorian critics and writers about photography who were struggling to convince skeptical contemporaries of theirs, or even trying to convince themselves, that these wonderful photographs that they loved were worthy of the status of art. The presence of an artist is a great help to this, and may have encouraged the enlargement of Hill's creative role. As I said earlier, the first criticism, the first critical writing, almost eliminates Adamson's role altogether, hardly mentioning him at all. Now, the great bulk of David Octavius Hill's documented behavior, and I am quite specific about that, I'm not talking about how he describes his role, relates to the promotion and advocacy of what he and Robert Adamson are doing. And this, to my mind, fits very, very well with the role he held for so many years as secretary of the Royal Scottish Academy, helping artists, promoting artists, organizing exhibitions, defending their interests. I think this is not just an honorable role that he could have been proud of within the partnership, but also one that modern scholarship would find as interesting as that of photographer or creator specifically. We're getting away from this great man, great creator idea now, and taking an interest in all of the people who make the photography possible. In this instance, let me mention the assistant at Carlton Hill, Jessie Mann, who's now believed to be the first woman to have taken a photograph in her own right. And I think it's also to Hill's great credit that he stayed with this after Adamson's death. Of course, there are discussions with Dr. John Adamson to continue the partnership with Hill. And there will be later a short tie-in with Thomas McGlashan, which I think is possibly something requiring more study to understand it properly. Hill would go on promoting the photographs well into the 1850s. And I admire him for that. It must have been a desperately depressing time for him. But there would be no more photographs. And I think I'd like to suggest that the tradition that Adamson came from actually continued beyond his death, not in Edinburgh, but in St Andrews, in the form of his brother and the people around his brother, continuing with photography and producing some marvelous work in the 1850s and 1860s. And then, of course, John Adamson's protege, Thomas Roger, going on well into the wet collodion era and practicing professionally. So that's me at an end. And I hope I have left some time for the question and answer session, Michael.
Thank you, James. That was absolutely fascinating and such an interesting story. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. Just to kick off the questions, and I'd encourage our audience to take advantage of having James here and drop any questions in the chat. But just to kick those off, then I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you've been looking after the album, because it does seem to be in remarkable condition. And does that suggest that it hasn't really been looked at over the last 100 and whatever so years?
I think it probably hasn't been looked at very much, no. And the classification would have been part of that. I've scoured the catalogues for photography here, and the fact that I found this by accident annoyed me hugely. But since we found it, we've tried to be as hands-off with it as we possibly can, because it is in good condition. The prints are unfaded. The binding is sound. We've given the end papers and the cover a very basic clean, and we've added further interleaving between the pages. I will like to express my extreme gratitude here that our conservator Joe Hockey was on hand for this, because suddenly finding a Hill and Adamson album in our midst was frankly quite alarming, and the sense of responsibility towards it in terms of its care, not just in terms of letting the world know that it's here, was a weight, and she took a great deal off from me. We have only brought it out twice, once for an in-person talk I gave in 2023, and tonight, and it spent the rest of the time in a purpose-made box, fully lined, and in a temperature-controlled part of the building.
Thank you for that. Do we have any questions from our audience? Because most of my other questions you answered during your presentation. So I was particularly interested in that relationship with A. Hill and his piece in the Edinburgh Courant advertisement, but you picked up on A. Hill later on, and also this question around the title page and letterpress. And I this is where I think a librarian probably can comment more knowledgeably than myself, but does that imply that are we talking about a book here, or are we talking about an album? Does the presence of a proper letterpress title page actually have more significance than we might give credit for?
I think it's an act of emulation, but it's not a complete act of emulation. The title page is mysterious because they've gone to such incredible trouble with it, and the style of it is almost 18th century. I can't explain it, but Talbot's albums, which they would have seen, and particularly some pictures in Scotland, had not just a title page but also had a contents list, and there were other textual material, which this album does not. It simply has the title page, then it has the images. That's it. No explanation, no help to the reader. So it is only a partial emulation. I don't think it was a publication. My hunch is that the accustomed text was simply repeated on the title page that was already being used on the back of prints. It's very hard to establish, though. Right. The chances are that with I think it was a very small production run, there's no sign in the numbers of prints that were made that more were being prepared. Obviously, more copies of these prints exist, but not in huge numbers. So I think my comment earlier that we may actually have all of the copies now holds good. There may be one or two to reappear elsewhere, but I don't think it's going to be a huge number more.
Right. Thank you again. We're slightly over time, so I think we probably need to bring proceedings to a close. But just one final question, and I just wonder how, if anyone is interested, how they might see the album and whether it is available for researchers and others to come and see in person.
Well, first of all, we're we're setting up a digital surrogate copy of it that will be available fairly soon. We're remaking the whole of our online provision at the moment, and so that the pages that are commonly there about our photography collection aren't there at the moment, but they will be reappearing, and there will be a full collection of the images here, and commentary on them, and directions to the literature as well. In terms of access to it, if there is a purpose, if the research calls for handling the actual item, then yes, we will make it available obviously under controlled circumstances, but it's not going to disappear behind a locked door and be absolutely inaccessible. We're very, very keen that what we have here be used by researchers, and that researchers know that they can access what we have. I would lose sleep. I'd have sleepless nights over it, but we'd make it available.
Okay, I think on that note, thank you again, James. And
thank you very much for having me, and thank you to everyone for coming along this evening.
Yeah, and thank you to your colleague as well for turning those pages so carefully and diligently. We appreciate that. And again, thank you to David Barber for arranging this evening and for introducing our speaker. And thank you again to our audience for staying with us throughout the whole presentation. Just to let you know that there's a further series of online talks coming up over the next few months. And there are also some live visits, including particularly to Laycock, where Andy Cochran, the curator there, will be talking around some of the collection and the changes coming through at Laycock. So take advantage of that. And you can find details of all of the online and live visits on the RPS website. And we'll send links through after this event also. So again, thank you, James. Thank you, David. And thank you to our audience. Good night, everyone.
Thanks very much. Good night.